Yonda pravishya mama vachamimam prasuptam sanjeevayadi akhilashaktidhar swadhamna anyamscha hastacharana sravanatvagadin pranan namo bhagavade purushaya tubhyam. We bow down to the Almighty Power who energizes and activates the entire universe as this indweller. Om, peace, peace, peace. Now let us meditate on that Almighty Power. Om Bhadram Karnebhih Sunayama Devaah Bhadram Pashyemakshabhiryajatraah Sthirairange Stushtuvam Sastanubhih Vyasema Devahidam Yadayuh Sustina Indro Vruddhasravaah Sustina Pusha Vishavedaah Sustina Stakshu Arishtanemi Sustino Brihaspadir Dadhatu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let the Almighty God enable us to see only good things with our eyes, hear only good things with our ears, and think only good thoughts with our mind, and let noble thoughts come to us from everywhere. Om, peace, peace, peace. Today our subject is Idealism and Pragmatism in Spiritual Life. At the very outset, I would like to state, by way of introduction, what I am going to propose to present before you. By pragmatism, we mean normally the idea or the doctrine which tells us that the meaning or significance of an idea or a philosophical doctrine lies in its observable consequences in our everyday life. This is what we normally mean by pragmatism, according to Charles Peirce, William James, and other exponents of modern times. And when we talk about idealism, I don't propose to present before you the logical idealism of Locke, or the subjective idealism of Berkeley, or the most ancient concept of idealistic philosophy found in the works of Plato and Aristotle. Because we had to deal with spiritual life. And neither Peirce or William James or Plato or Aristotle directly deal with the problems of spiritual life. Though they refer to religion and the problems of religious life, the rationale or its absence of religious life, they don't directly deal with the problem of spiritual life. So when we have to talk about spiritual life, and the relation of pragmatism and idealism in spiritual life, I have to turn to the Upanishads. There is no other way out. Because Upanishadic philosophy of spiritual life deals with both the pragmatic as well as the idealistic aspects of life as a whole. As a beginning, I can just quote the original verse from Yajurveda, Taittiriya Upanishad, just by way of introduction, and then I shall give a detailed exposition in English. There is a convocation address in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Now, in ancient times, especially in the early Vedic age, young boys used to be sent to a great teacher, mostly a hermit living in the distant forests. The father may be a very learned person, but still after giving the preliminary education in Vedic philosophy, the father normally would send his child, one which child will be around 12 years by the time, to a great teacher who is not a relative of his, who may be staying far away in a forest hermitage. So you come across many such teachers in the Vedic Upanishadic tradition. Uddalaka, Aruni, Gautama, then Sanat Kumara, Pravahana Jaivali, and so on. And many eminent students also you come across, who later appear in the succeeding chapters of the same Upanishad as teachers. I'm just presenting a convocation address. So here, a teacher gives a series of instructions to his disciple, who has completed his education, Vedic education, in the hermitage, and who is going home. The beginning of the formal education was called Upanayana, and the conclusion was called Samavartana. Means after receiving full instruction, the student would return home. That process is called Samavartana, means going back after receiving full instruction. Instruction not in spiritual life alone, but also not only in religious or spiritual philosophy, but also in its practical application in everyday life, especially the instructions necessary for an ideal household. That is very important. Vedam anuchi acharyaha andayavansinam anushasti satyam vada dharmam chara satyana pramadidavyam dharmana pramadidavyam bhutena pramadidavyam kushilana pramadidavyam matrudevo bhava pitrudevo bhava acharya devo bhava adithi devo bhava yani anavadyani karmani tani sevidavyani noidarani. This is the first part of the instruction. Now I will come to the translation and interpretation. First of all, the teacher tells the student, after having completed instruction, tell the truth and never deviate from truth, and practice and be established in the ideals of righteousness, and never deviate from the teachings of righteousness, and never show any complacency or indifference or lethargy in performing one's duties and responsibilities in the life of an ideal household. So, and then there is a clear instruction, you should never neglect those activities which enable you to bring wealth and money and resources to your home, so that you would be able to look after your family, your children, your parents, and pay taxes to the king. These are the ideas included here. And not only that, you should always be proficient and prompt in executing your daily duties and responsibilities in everyday life. Kushalana pradivyavyam means Atma Samrakshanat Karmanaha na Pramadidavyam. This is the Shankaracharya's commentary. I am interpreting that part of the commentary. You should never be lethargic or lazy or indifferent in promptly executing your duties and responsibilities befitting the life of an ideal household. And then comes, you should respect your parents, mother and father, your teacher and your guests. You should honor them as much as you honor God himself. This is a hyperbole. It is that's a Vedic way of stating, Vedic way of emphasizing, stressing one particular instruction. You find this throughout the Vedic Upanishad literature. Now here you find a synthesis of pragmatism and idealism in its highest. We have to remember these instructions are not meant for monks and hermits and sannyasis. These instructions are meant for householders. These instructions are meant to enable the disciple to become an ideal father to his children, an ideal husband to his wife, an ideal son to his mother and father, an ideal citizen of the country, an enlightened, responsible citizen of the country. This is the motive behind. Now, these ideas were actually practiced in ancient times, in the Upanishadic Vedic period. A number of examples are cited in the Pauranic and Upanishadic literature, which gives us a picture of those enlightened people who synthesized, who harmonized the highest of pragmatic and the highest of the idealistic philosophies of life in their everyday existence. One example, Swamiji refers to this example more than once in his lectures on practical Vedanta and elsewhere also. That is about the life of an householder. His name is Vyatha. I remember he was working in a slaughterhouse. He was a meat seller. Apparently not the life of a man of renunciation. Now, and his name was Vyatha. But in the Mahabharata, he is portrayed as an ideal philosopher who taught the highest of Vedanta philosophy to a great monk, to a great yogi, at the same time practicing the highest ideals, highest pragmatic ideals of spiritual life in his everyday existence. So I shall just present this story. It comes in one of the Puranas. It's called the Nrisimha Purana. And that particular chapter is the Pativrata Brahmachari Samvadaha. Means a dialogue between an ideal chaste wife and a brahmachari. Let us say monk. This is the narration. Later, the scene switches over to the life and teachings of the great meat seller with the name Vyatha. So, at the beginning of this chapter, a great yogi is sitting under a tree, a monk, meditating and practicing austerity for decades. And as a result of this practice of concentration, he attained great powers, miraculous powers, occult powers. So this Mahabharata says, once a bird came and sat on the branch of a tree under which she was sitting, and naturally when birds flock together, they make a lot of noise. And this yogi was a bit disturbed. He got angry and he stared at the bird, and the bird was turned to ashes. So he was very happy because after years of concentration, practicing concentration, he had attained some occult powers. So he was very happy. And after that he got up and he went in search of an householder who would give him alms. Just as during the Middle Ages in Europe, in the Franciscan or Dominican friars who used to go about from place to place, seeking alms for the monastery. You find in those days, maybe 3,000 years earlier, in India, monks and hermits used to go about. Sometimes these hermits and monks might have been emperors. You find in the Ramayana Itihasa, the great mighty emperor of that time, Dileba, practiced this sort of austerity for 12 years. He didn't, of course, burn birds into ashes, that's a different matter, but he was a great ascetic. He led the life of an ideal ascetic, practiced meditation and concentration, sitting in caves and under trees, and then went about begging for alms and lived the life of a beggar, though he was actually an emperor. And after this stipulated period of austerity, he went back to his palace. Such stories you find in Mahabharata and Ramayana and the Puranic literature also. These kinds of austerities were practiced by even kings and emperors. So they were not penniless beggars, that's what I am going to stress. So this monk, yogi, he went about seeking alms, and he reached the home of an old lady. And there he found, he shouted 3-4 times, standing on the gate, Bhavati Bhiksham Dehi. This is the Bhavati means addressing the respectful term. Please give me alms. This is the Sanskrit term they used to announce like that. Just as Franciscan monks used to announce alms to for Saint Francis like that in Middle Ages. So this was the practice in ancient time, in ancient India. So one lady asked him to wait for some time. Maybe not in a very polite tone, because the man was repeating again and again, give me alms. After that, the lady came out, and this man thought, well, I have acquired a power to burn to ashes, and here is a woman who had the audacity to ask me to wait. And he asked her, do you know whom you are speaking to? Do you know who is standing at your gate, at your door, asking for alms? She said, well, I know very well, but there are no birds here for you to burn to ashes, he said. So the man suddenly was highly impressed. Here is a lady who already understood what I did half an hour ago, some far away, not here, far away. There is no way that the lady could have come to know what he had done. But this yogi was a very enlightened person in his own way. He was not a fool. He understood there is something great about this woman. I must ask her about the mystery, how she came to know of this. And he asked her, how did you know that half an hour back I burned a bird to ashes? How did you come to know of that? She said, I am doing the duty of an ideal housewife. I am looking after my parents, looking after my aged husband, and I am looking after my children. I am doing the duty of an ideal household. And she in her turn teaches some Vedantic doctrines to this yogi. And this man was naturally impressed. Remember, he was a well-trained yogi. So though he was a bit arrogant, he had the wisdom to understand that there is something great about this woman who is standing in front of him. So he asked her, who is your teacher? From whom did you learn this power of ideal? Where did you get this knowledge of ideal life? How did you get this wisdom? Then he said, well, I shall give you the name and address of this man. You go this way, turn to the left, walk for some distance, then you'll come to a place, you find an uncouth, unpleasant-looking man will be sitting somewhere. And she gave the name Vyatha. You go and try to find him out. So this man might have thought, well, this must be a big yogi with a long beard, sitting on meditative posture, concentrating on God. So it would be easy for me to find out. And he went in search of that man, mentioned by this housewife. And he walked and found out he entered a market where people were selling meat. So he was not very much impressed. But anyhow, he was a tenacious man. He ultimately came to the place where the lady had said the man will be sitting. And there he found a meat seller, an uncouth-looking, unpleasant-looking man, cutting meat, weighing and selling to customers. And he went and stood in front of him, and the man raised his eyes and said, "Oh, you sit there. Oh, that lady sent you here." I think this man, the yogi, was suddenly surprised. So this man also, he knows that I am sent here by that housewife. And he stood there, he sat there patiently. And after some time, after he had sent away his customers, he was about to close his shop. "No, I shall spend half an hour with you." And this man, this meat seller, starts his long discussion on some of the most profound principles of Vedanta. This is what the Mahabharata tells us. So its name is Vyadha. The particular portion is called Vyadha Gita in the Mahabharata. One of the most sublime chapters, episodes in the entire Mahabharata classic, which contains more than 100,000 verses. That means it must be more than 7 or 8 times the size of Odyssey and Iliad put together. That's the size of Mahabharata. Now, in this chapter, Vyadha tells him that religion or spirituality is not a set of doctrines alone. It is, of course, doctrines do have a place. If you practice the teaching or instruction or learning of these doctrines as a spiritual practice, it becomes both philosophy and also practice. But these ideas can be practiced and should be practiced by people, and they help an ordinary man in solving the problems of everyday life. Vyadha says, Vedanta doesn't solve your problems, rather. He goes further. He says, but it enables you to bring out the inner power within you, which will help you to solve the problems. It's not that this philosophy completely eliminates the problem, but it equips you with a philosophy of life, with an ideal of life, which enables you to look at these problems with a sense of equanimity, so you are able to transcend the problems. That's the role of religion. That's really the role of religion. God or spirituality doesn't give us bread, house, jobs, or money. But spiritual ideas give us a philosophy of life, which enables us to acquire these things in the proper manner and to live with these things and lead an ideal life, and will give you a perfect equanimity of mind. That is the real role of religion and spirituality. That is, Swami Vivekananda points out this again and again. He asked this question, what is the role of spirituality in practical life, in pragmatic life? Swamiji raised this question because when he was traveling in European countries, in America, in the last decade of 19th century, many asked this question, put this question to Swamiji. Swamiji, can your Vedanta or religion solve the problems of modern man? What Swamiji used to stress again and again is, Vedanta doesn't give you bread, Vedanta doesn't bring you money, it doesn't give you house or status or any of the worldly pleasures. But Vedanta gives you, equips you with a philosophy of life, with an ideal of life, which gives you the right mindset, the right attitude, the right approach, the ability to take the right approach towards these things, so that getting these things or not getting these things will not be a big dilemma for you. That's what Swamiji says. And there Swamiji refers to two types of approaches, two types of attitudes which normally a man takes towards pragmatism and idealism in spiritual life. Sometimes people tries to bring the ideal down to their level. That's one approach. And Swamiji criticizes this approach. If the great teachings enshrined the religious scriptures are beyond our reach, if we cannot bring them to our practical life, we try to give a new interpretation to the very idea of life. That's what really happens. And Swamiji strongly criticized this approach. We should not bring the ideal to the practical. We must rather try to raise the practical to the ideal level. That's what Swamiji says. There should be a perfect synthesis of the pragmatic and the idealistic, the practical and the idealistic. But this synthesis should not be achieved by bringing the ideal down to the practical level. Because that means if you do that, we are sacrificing, we are losing the greatness of a great philosophy of life. Rather, we must strive to raise the ideal to a higher level and try to raise the practical life to the level of ideal. So the synthesis should be achieved by constantly striving, working to raise practical life to the level of the ideal. Not bringing ideal to the practical, but by raising practical to the ideal. Because if man becomes obsessed with the practical, with the pragmatic ideas, with pragmatism, what really happens, he may reduce himself into an automaton, or he may bring himself down to the level of the animal kingdom. Animals are highly practical, highly pragmatic. Pragmatism is the ideal which guides animal kingdom. Not pragmatism as a philosophical ideal as expounded by modern thinkers like William James. That's what I mean. I mean, they observe things, the consequences, accordingly they adjust their instincts and their behavior. This is what the animals do. They don't have a higher ideal to guide them. On the other hand, if we get obsessed with idealism, without bothering to raise the practical to the ideal, what happens? We may perhaps live in a world of utopia. It becomes a kind of utopian idealism. Both should be avoided. So the highest of the realistic and the highest of the idealistic trends of life should be synthesized. This is what Swamiji tried to present before his audiences when he was dealing with the subject of idealism and pragmatism in spiritual life. Maybe another example I can present before you, that is also from Yajurveda, that is found in the Kathopanishad. As everyone knows, this Kathopanishad is nothing but a dialogue between a great teacher and an ideal disciple, a very polite, humble disciple. The disciple's name is Nachiketa and the teacher's name is Yama. I won't go into the details of the story, background. I will directly come to the subjects. It so happened that Nachiketa was one day sitting in his home and he found his father was performing a Vedic ritual in which his father was trying to deceive himself, deceive others. Instead of giving good cows, good things to giving as gifts to his guest. He was giving old cows which won't give milk and rotten fruits, all these things. So this young boy was only 5 years old. He got a bit perturbed because my father is doing something which you should not do. So he asked the question, and father said, if you bother me with this sort of questions again and again, I shall send you to the Lord of Death. Means I would rather see that you don't exist any longer. Something like that, he said. And the boy, taking his words in the literary sense, went to the abode of death. That's how the mythological story goes. We are not concerned with this part of the story. Anyhow, the boy reached the palace of the Lord of Death. He waited for 3 days. The teacher, Yama, was away. He returned the 3rd day, and Yama found that this young boy he was waiting for him without eating anything for the last 3 days. So he felt very sad. So as a compensation, he asked the boy, you asked for 3 boons. I'm sorry that you remained here waiting for me for 3 days without eating anything. You were hungry. So please don't mind, but I shall give you 3 great boons. Please ask for these 3 boons. Nachiketa asked for 3 boons, which again you can find present the picture of a man's evolution from pragmatism to idealism, and ultimately to the synthesis of both in spiritual life. So the first boon which the boy asked to us this, you must see that I don't have to suffer anything on account of my coming here. So when I go back to my home, my father should talk to me happily, and he should not get angry with me because I have come here disobeying my father. So please see that I don't have to suffer on account of this. Yama agreed immediately. Well, your father will be happy with you when you go back. So, just that's the requirement of an ordinary man. He wants to get his everyday problems solved. For that, he go to religious books. He read religious books. He may seek refuge in religion and spirituality. That's what really happens. So there, it is pure pragmatism in its most mundane, earthly level. Well, if you meet God in front of you, Swami Vivekananda once asked, what will you ask him for? Sri Ramakrishna, before Swamiji, Sri Ramakrishna again in the Gospel, he says, to one of his disciples, Sri Ramakrishna asked, he had a disciple, a rich man, and who was very proud of contributing money to charitable institutions, running hospitals, and donating to some educational societies and so on. He was very proud. Sri Ramakrishna was not against this. In fact, he was a great teacher who encouraged people who did help charitable institutions as an act of compassion. But this man was very haughty and proud, and he possibly thought that if he just gives us a little money to some institutions, that's the end of spiritual life, nothing more to be done in one's spiritual life. So Sri Ramakrishna wanted to correct him. So he asked him the question, if God appears before you tomorrow, would you ask him for establishing some hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions? Or would you ask for spiritual inner enlightenment? Thereby, by putting this question to his devotees, Sri Ramakrishna was trying to drive home that we must not be content, we must not be satisfied with just asking for worldly pleasures or worldly enjoyments to God. People who ask for worldly enjoyments do have a place in spiritual life. Gita says that. Gita says that all people, whether they pray to God for worldly pleasures, or those who pray for health, and those who pray for some spiritual values, and those great ideal devotees who pray for spiritual enlightenment, All of them are devotees of God. They belong to different stages in the evolution of one's spiritual journey. That's what Gita says. So, but Sri Ramakrishna found this man was under the impression that he should stop with some charitable work. He need not go beyond that. So Sri Ramakrishna asked him, if God appears before you, you should not be satisfied with asking for worldly pleasures, worldly adjustments. You must ask for something which is much more precious, which is everlasting, that is spiritual enlightenment. So Nachiketa also realized suddenly that there is something beyond this worldly life, something beyond a happy life of an household. So because after all a man may live for 100 years, that's nothing more. Life is not everlasting. So Nachiketa asked the second question. Well, I shall ask you for another boon. When I die, I must go to a higher level of existence. You must bless me so that I would be able to go to heaven after my death. That boon also was readily granted by his teacher, Yama. Then Nachiketa realized, well, there is something still beyond that. And here remember, this is a special characteristic of Upanishadic philosophy. Upanishadic philosophy is the only spiritual philosophy which tells you that there is something even beyond heaven. All other non-Advaitic, non-Upanishadic religious philosophies of India and most other religious philosophies associated with the Abrahamic religions and non-Abrahamic religions stop with going to heaven. Now Upanishads tell us that going to heaven is a good thing, a great thing, but that is not an eternal achievement from a spiritual point of view. Upanishads say there is something beyond heaven, and that is the stage of spiritual enlightenment. And that's what Nachiketa was asking as his third boon. So he asked this boon, putting the whole matter in the form of an analysis of human life. He says, he gives a very philosophical analysis of the dynamics of human existence. He says, some people say that this life is all that exists. When we die, everything comes to an end. There is nothing beyond the grave, beyond the cremation ground. And some people say something continues to exist even beyond death. Death is not the end of existence. Death is not the end of the journey, not end of the road. There is something beyond this. What is that mystery? In fact, if you can solve the mystery of death, you can also solve the mystery of life. Because what we mean by death is nothing but the end of life in its empirical, visible form. If that's the end of the journey, then this life is not eternal. Nothing in this world is eternal. But if something exists even after death, that should be eternal. So Nachiketa put this question. Some people say that this death is the end of everything, and according to some other schools of thought, there is something beyond death, something which exists during the post-mortem stage. Eyam preti vijikitsa manushi asti tyege nayam asti dichaige edad vidya manusishtastoyaham varanam mesha varastrutiyega. Why am I quoting the verse? Because Nachiketa ends, he concludes this request by saying, you alone can teach me this truth to me. No one else can, because you are supposed to be the Lord of death. This is a mythological story, but there is a great philosophical and spiritual truth behind it. And then the teacher tests Nachiketa to see whether he is actually a fit student for learning the supreme mystery of life, which is also the supreme mystery of death. And when the teacher found that he was a fit disciple, he teaches him. Then he says that there is the Supreme Consciousness, which is everlasting, and this phenomenon of life, death and rebirth will come to an end when you realize that you are the Supreme Consciousness, which is in the Upanishad, which is called Atman in the Upanishadic philosophy. And that Supreme Consciousness is beyond life and beyond death. It is never born, therefore it never dies. Because birth is nothing but the emergence of something into the visible form, and death is the disappearance. So Yama tells him that even before you were born, this consciousness existed, and even after your death, it will continue to exist. This is the eternal truth. Now here also you can find another picture. In Vyatha, you find a very ordinary man, practically not a hermit meditating in the caves, but an ordinary man who was a meat seller. But he realized that spirituality has got two dimensions. One, understanding the supreme truth, meditating upon it. The other, practicing it in everyday life. So, even a meat seller can be a highly enlightened spiritual personality. So, this is the picture of the synthesis of pragmatism and idealism. Another example, again you can have in the Upanishadic philosophy. I am presenting this example because these examples demonstrate more than any doctrine or book how one can practice pragmatism and idealism in spiritual life. Very often, when we read a great book, a great philosophical book, which presents before us the idealistic view of spiritual life, we are tempted to live in intellectual plane. This really comes to many people. When we read a great book, especially the highly philosophical doctrines, enshrined books like Gita or mystical, great mystical works of great saints, we intellectually perceive, we intellectually understand those ideas, and then we try to live in the world of those ideas. And then we try to delude ourselves into the belief that we have really attained to that level. But our mind will be far behind. And in reality, most of us live at the mental level. 99% of our existence is at the mental level. So if there is a wide gap between the intellectual level and mental level, mental level, I mean emotional level, there is always the problem of deluding oneself into thinking that we have actually reached that level. Swamiji refers to this point. So, in fact, he doesn't directly come to this idea, but when he refers to the Hegelian idealism and the German idealism, Kant, he comes to the point. See, in most of these philosophical systems, what really happens is, one is called a Kantian or a utilitarian or an empiricist or neo-positivist. If he teaches those doctrines in a university or college, or if he writes book on those doctrines, or if he expounds these doctrines in a public platform. But in Vedanta, there is something different. But we call it, in the Vedanta tradition, called Sampradaya. It has got a corresponding aspect in daily life. So a doctrine is not just a theory. A doctrine has a place, but doctrine is meant for understanding and contemplating. It is called Sravana and Manana. I mean, listening with proper attention and contemplating on the meaning of what we listen. This is one aspect. And then meditating and mentally identifying with those ideas. So, in Vedanta, this practical dimension is equally important. An example you find again in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. There is the great teacher Janaka and another great teacher Yajnavalkya. Janaka is sometimes the teacher and sometimes he is a student also. In front of Yajnavalkya he becomes a student. At the same time, when he himself teaches philosophy and spirituality to his disciples, he acts as a teacher. Janaka was a great king and emperor, and he puts a number of questions before Yajnavalkya, and Yajnavalkya answers them. And Janaka belonged to that galaxy, that hierarchy of great kings who are called Rajarshis in Vedantic tradition. Those who combine in their life the pragmatism and dynamism of kings or administrators and the idealism, spiritual idealism of hermits. They call Rajarshi, mean Rajanascha, Rishayascha, Rajarshaya. You find this. So, a king a king in the field of action, but a sage in the field of contemplation. If one is obsessed with action, with pragmatism, he may perhaps reduce himself into a mere utilitarian. But if he lives in the world of ideas only, he may reduce himself into a utopian. So both extremes should be avoided. So Janaka is a supreme example. Janaka was a great king. Once it so happened that somebody rushed to his court and announced that, see, your kingdom, your palace is on fire. Somebody has set fire to your palace. Then Janaka declared, well, if my palace gets lost, I'm not going to lose anything. Don't think that Janaka was a lazy man sitting somewhere like, let us telephone the fire engine office. Not like. Janaka must have immediately took the necessary steps to put out fire. That is true. But doing that, Janaka said, well, even if the whole thing gets burnt, I am not going to lose anything. This is the synthesis of pragmatism and idealism. You should always remember, because when I present this episode, sometimes there is a possibility of misunderstanding. People may think that Janaka was a man who was living in a world of fantasy, who was complacent, who was indifferent to his duties. But Janaka appears as one of the most dynamic and successful and active monarchs of Indian history. But that Janaka also was a great philosopher. In Plato's concept of philosopher kings, this you can perhaps the Upanishadic concept of, or the Vedantic concept of philosopher king, Rajarshi, is a prelude to what Plato expounded in the Republic and other books, maybe 3-4 millennia later. That's what I'm saying. So this you find. And Sri Krishna says, this synthesis of the highest pragmatism and highest idealism was the concept of ideal life in ancient India. And Sri Krishna had to preach the Gita because people had forgotten it. So in the 4th chapter of Gita, Sri Krishna tells, in ancient times, great kings and emperors who were active administrators, very dynamic and very efficient, practiced not only the philosophy of action but also the philosophy of contemplation. But gradually, somehow, this was lost. And therefore, Sri Krishna had to preach this to Arjuna. And there was a special reason why Sri Krishna chose Arjuna, preferred Arjuna as his student. Sri Krishna could have taught this to Bhima, Yudhishthira and others. Yudhishthira was a very wise man, but absolutely inactive. Even and not only that, Yudhishthira was not very much confused. He was a wise man. Bhima was perhaps that sort of man who would understand even if he had listened to Krishna. Nakula and Sahadeva were somewhat immature. And there were other great men in Mahabharata, like Bhishma and others. Bhishma. They were all great wise men of those days. But then they knew things, they would not practice it. Because they knew already these things. But Arjuna was the right student. Because he was a naturally active man. Very efficient, very dynamic, and very active. But somehow he got confused as to what he was to do and what he was not to do. So he comes to see Krishna, and Krishna advises him and teaches him this philosophy of synthesis of pragmatism and idealism. Where pragmatism enables us to be active and face the problems of everyday life. Idealism saves us from becoming an automaton or a machine. Because if one gets obsessed with pragmatism, his status, his position will not be very different from that of a machine. And if he gets obsessed with idealism only, without a practical dimension, there is a possibility of his living in a world of ideas. And that may lead to a kind of utopianism. So Vedanta, in fact, combines in itself the highest ideals of pragmatism and the highest ideals of idealism. Here, when I use the word idealism, I should always remind you, I don't mean the idealism of Plato, logical idealism of Locke, subjective idealism of Berkeley. I don't mean that. What I mean is the act of translating into daily life as a tool for solving everyday problems, the teachings of Vedanta. That's what I mean. And now I shall conclude. Om Bhadram Karne Vishunayama Devaha Bhadram Pasyemakshabiryajatraha Sthirairangehi Sushtuvam Sastanobhi Vyasema Devahidam Yadayuhu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let the Almighty God enable us to see only good things and hear only good words around us. Let noble thoughts come to us from everywhere. Om, peace, peace, peace.